bow in prayer. Holy and eternal God, your creative power and presence is at work each moment of each day, bringing life. Your gracious love is always near, seeking to draw us closer and closer to your heart. Help us to be open to you throughout each day. Help us to be open to you in a special way in these next few moments. And may you be pleased to use my words, all of our thoughts, all of our meditations, and through them and in spite of them, draw us closer to your truth and to your love. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Have you ever gotten angry or lost your temper? I'm sure all of us have done that at least once in our life. Becoming upset and angry is a natural emotion. For many, anger and upset is an explosion of hurtful words or yelling or maybe even violent acts. You might hit the furniture, punch the wall, etc. And for those nearby, it is scary, uncomfortable, sometimes a dangerous place to be when someone is angry in that way. For other people, they've learned to direct their anger into appropriate language that still might be biting, but communicates the anger, but it's not destructive. And for still others, anger includes a variety of actions they take. Maybe severing relationships, maybe having very frank conversations about behavior with someone, or maybe even creating a plan to overcome the cause of the anger and bring reconciliation. What you do with your anger and your upset is something that you can control, you can learn to control. Well, today we have a story from the Gospel of John, which Maureen read for us, about Jesus becoming angry. And today we see a time when Jesus caused a disturbance at the temple in Jerusalem. He upset the money changers' tables, he threw the coins all over the floor, he released and chased out the animals which had been penned and ready for the acts of sacrifice and worship at the temple. And he spoke in anger at those who ran the temple, complaining that they had made the temple into a marketplace rather than a place of prayer for all people. But before we say, wow, even Jesus lost his temper and got mad, so I'm not so bad, we need to look more closely and realize that there's a lot more going on here than Jesus just acting in a boorish way. Jesus' anger was planned and it had a purpose. Through this act of overturning the money changers' table and chasing the animals and the people from the courtyard and condemning the religious leadership of the temple, Jesus is proclaiming that he is the Messiah of God who calls the nation, the people of faith, back to the essence of what it means to be God's people. Jesus uses his anger in a prophetic way. You see, in the Bible, a prophet is someone who speaks God's message to his or her own people, a relevant message that is meant for the present, not usually for the future. We think prophets is talking about the future, predicting things. In the Bible, prophecy is primarily about a message from God for the present. And prophets in the Bible were individuals, or sometimes there were schools of individuals who made a career of being prophets for God in ancient Israel. And sometimes prophets spoke with words, sometimes they had visions which they revealed, and sometimes they enacted a wordless demonstration to teach a message of God. For example, a prophet might walk through the streets in chains, for example, to proclaim that Israel was in danger of being enslaved by foreign lands. One prophet married a woman who was unfaithful to him to demonstrate God's commitment to Israel, who had been unfaithful to God. Jeremiah ratified the purchase of family land and had the deed notarized in public and buried in clay pots just before the nation was to be conquered by a foreign empire whose army was standing at the gates ready to take over. And the teaching of that act, of him doing something normal like that, was the emphasis that Israel would one day be free and liberated again by the power of God, and land and commerce, family life, society would once again be normal. So it was an act of hope he was demonstrating. So prophets often use drama to proclaim a message of hope, a message of judgment, a message of warning, a message of truth from God. Now in John's passage, he shows us that Jesus is a prophet of God, meaning one who brings God's message. And the message of God is a judgment on the temple elite and the denial of access to God that the religion of the temple had become, which was the very opposite to what the temple was to be. And Jesus enacts that message like the prophets of old when he overturns the money changers' tables. Now, we're told in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Jesus was upset because they were cheating the poor people out of their money when they came to offer their worship and had to buy the sacrifices and had to change their money. John's Gospel today doesn't make that accusation. He has another reason. In verse 16 he says, Jesus told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His condemnation, it appears, is that in the attempt to do legitimate work at the temple, they needed to have the animals, they needed to sell, change the coins. In attempt to do legitimate work, they'd lost the purpose of the temple. The temple was to be a place of prayer for all people, and the courtyard, where the selling went on with all its noise and commerce, was the only place the Gentiles, the non-Jewish world, were allowed to pray. But instead of having the needed animals and money changers outside the temple gates, they moved into the outermost court, a place of prayer for the Gentiles. What could have been a place of prayer and reflection for spiritual renewal was overcome with the noise and the business of commerce. And the people who lost out were those Gentiles who lost intimate access to God. When Jesus makes this dramatic public action of anger against the practices that were in effect denying access to God and the worship of the temple, whether we accept the reason given by John or the reason given by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is acting in the role of a prophet. His act of anger was planned and it was staged. There was a message in his method of causing a disturbance at the temple that day. Now, John makes the point that Jesus didn't just lose his temper or lose his cool, as we might say, and explode in anger. He planned his action. In verse 15 it says, "Making a whip of cord, Jesus drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables." Did you hear it? He took time to make a whip. How long would that take? Jesus didn't just explode spontaneously. He planned an assault on the power of the temple authorities. This was not an out-of-control incident where someone lost his temper. This was a prophetic act challenging the power of the religious leadership. Later, after the resurrection, Jesus' disciples would remember this act and see it as a fulfillment of the scriptural reference in Zechariah 14:21, which says, "There shall no longer be traitors in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day." By his action, Jesus was announcing, they said, that the day of the Lord's coming was happening now in him. And after this action of disturbance in the temple, Jesus speaks a message about the future. He says that this temple will be destroyed and I will raise it up in 3 days. Now, of course, he's referring to his death and resurrection. But the Jewish leaders take it literally, thinking he's referring to the temple which King Herod had been building for some 46 years. Now, a word of caution whenever you read the Gospel of John. Whenever the Gospel of John refers to the Jews did this or the Jews did that, we have to be careful in our interpretation. John does not mean the Jewish population or the Jews as a people. After all, Jesus was a Jew, all his disciples were Jews, hundreds and thousands of Galilean and Judean people, all Jews loved Jesus. The word John uses, perpetual word, which is translated Jews in our Bible, and if he condemns the Jews, he uses that word. He's referring to the Jewish elites and the religious and political leadership who opposed Jesus, not the whole population. So you always have to remember that when you're reading John. In Jesus' teaching, therefore, today, he's challenging the Jews, the Jewish leadership. And he's teaching them and the disciples and the crowds to realize that he's proclaiming a new message of God that says God will not be limited or boxed in by a temple, but the Spirit of God will be found in a new temple, which is Jesus' own body. And even if that temple, his body is destroyed, it will be raised again. In other words, through the resurrection we discover that nothing can box in, limit, destroy, or defeat the power of God's Spirit. Now, there are many messages from this passage and insights that you could gather, but today I would share this reflection. I was thinking that this passage challenges us to think about the place of anger for a modern Christian faith. Usually, we don't think Christians should become angry because we associate anger with abusive language, intolerant attitudes, a closing down of conversation, or even violent acts. But Christians in modern times are called to be angry at times, just as we are also called to be peacemakers, just as we're also called to be agents of forgiveness and comfort, just as we're also called to be a people of compassion and generosity, justice and healing. Now, the anger we are talking about, however, is the anger that was demonstrated by the prophets of old and by Jesus himself in this passage. This is anger that is controlled. Remember, Jesus planned it by taking time to make the web. This is anger that has a purpose and a message. Remember, Jesus told them they had forgotten the purpose of the temple, that it was to be a place of prayer for all nations, that God, in other words, is the God of welcoming, inclusive love for all people. And thirdly, this anger is one that still engages in conversation to promote truth and new life. Notice that Jesus still talks to the religious elites in the temple even after his dramatic action. A conversation goes on. The religious leaders use the words, "Show us a sign." In other words, convince us you are true. Convince us you are from God. Convince us your teaching is meant to be believed. And in that conversation, you'll notice, Jesus does not condemn them, ridicule them, verbally abuse them, but reveals a deeper insight to them by revealing to them a prophecy concerning the near future about his death and resurrection by saying the temple will be torn down and be rebuilt in 3 days. Now, in modern Canada, there are many things that can make us angry or hurt or upset. It's natural. But as Christians, I think maybe we're called to control our anger by managing it in a constructive way. We, like Jesus, are called to use anger when needed to promote a greater revelation of the love of God. So some suggestions for how to navigate angry times as a Christian community. First of all, whenever you're angry, I'm wondering if the thing we need to do, and I say this for myself as well, is say, why are we angry? Oftentimes it's because we're afraid of something new. That's what makes us angry, something new. Sometimes it's because we feel disrespected. Sometimes it's because someone has hurt us with hurtful words or even acts of injustice. So first thing is to ask, why are we angry? By knowing why we are angry, then maybe we can decide on the next course of action. Sometimes that course of action means we need to let it go. Sometimes the course of action is to realize the problem is us, not the other people. And sometimes we need to figure out then what's the appropriate positive response, what's required. Secondly, when is it right to be angry? Well, from a faith perspective, I would suggest it is right to be angry if someone is being belittled, if groups of people are victims of racism or sexism or prejudice or homophobia, and the list goes on. If injustice is being perpetrated against those who have the least power to answer back, the vulnerable, the forgotten, those who don't have a voice in society, those who are too afraid to speak for themselves, well, then it's right to be angry. And thirdly, how are we to use anger in positive ways? That's got to be the question. Anger, as far as it goes with us as Christians, is meant to proclaim a positive teaching concerning our faith. If we are angry that an individual or a group is being victimized by Facebook or government policy or community intolerance, or by acts of unkindness or disrespect, even in the church or in the community, then we need to counter those actions and attitudes with words or acts that promote kindness or justice or respect for all people. We need to find constructive ways to engage in conversations that will promote a better tone of truth and dialogue. Calmness, listening, checking and speaking facts, and if at all possible, enabling the voices of those who are ignored to be heard is part of the calling in response to justified anger. On our Lenten journey, we reflect on a truth that we live in a world where many people are angry or upset for many different reasons. As people of faith, we too can become trapped by destructive or life-destroying anger. But as followers of Christ, we are challenged and invited to be free from destructive anger and instead listen carefully for God's welcoming, inclusive, life-giving love. We are to embrace that love by acts of kindness and justice, forgiveness, healing, and compassion. And we are to hear the call of God's positive anger that seeks to bring life for all. Jesus shows us today, I would suggest, the role that holy anger plays in God's revelation of God's truth and vision for the world. And the vision we see is a God who is passionate about caring for the forgotten, the vulnerable, about welcoming and including all people in God's embrace, and about creating a people of faith who pursue a justice and truth that brings life to all. Amen.